Hi guys, I'm Eytan Weinstein of the Two Nice Jewish Boys podcast, and I'm here to react to John Oliver's latest breakdown of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the current round of violence. Let's go.
Okay, there is a lot to unpack there, from the horror of the situation, which has escalated significantly since then, to the use of the phrase tit-for-tat war in a conflict where you just pointed out one side has suffered over 10 times the casualties. Something which speaks to both the severe power imbalance at play here and how that often gets obscured by how we choose to talk about it.
So let's talk about power imbalance, okay? Because this is another thing that's been coming up a lot, not just with John Oliver, but Trevor Noah's recent video. I don't see the issue here. Just because one country is powerful, more powerful than the other, does not mean it has more responsibility. This is war. Both sides have a responsibility to be moral and ethical and act in a humane way. Power doesn't change your responsibility. The bullshit line from Spider-Man, guys, stop taking your lessons from Marvel Comics.
If you are not fluent in Middle East history, I know this can seem overwhelming. The latest chapter in a long story you haven't read. So I'm not going to try and recap the history here.
So basically what John Oliver is saying is, I don't have all the facts, or at least I'm not going to present you with all the facts, and I'm just going to go to a conclusion, and you should trust me because I'm a funny little British man.
Propose a solution, although interestingly, I do have one, because someone with this accent always thinks they can fix things in the Middle East. I redrew the map a bit, and I have a lot of misplaced confidence that it would work very well.
Ha. Ha.
But this week's actually been a pretty good reminder that while some things are incredibly complex and require a great deal of context, others are just wrong.
Correct. Some things don't require all that much context. For those of you who aren't aware of all the facts, the simple breakdown is Hamas is a terrorist organization who suppresses women, homosexuals. They don't care about human life. They fire on Israel indiscriminately. Thousands of rockets since the beginning of this round, thousands of rockets in the past since Israel disengaged from Gaza, gave them Gaza in 2005, and since then they've been raining terror on Israel's southern population. They don't care about human life. They live in squalor because they spend all of their money on terrorism, while Israel just seeks peace. It's fighting to protect its civilian population against Hamas, which is using its civilian population to protect itself while trying to fire on Israel's civilians. That's the simple breakdown.
One of the incidents that's been a flashpoint, the planned expulsion of Palestinians who've lived in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood for generations. It's currently tied up in the Israeli court system, with the foreign ministry calling it a real estate dispute. But it's worth knowing that the UN's Commissioner for Human Rights has said that these expulsions would violate Israel's obligations under international law. So it is not hard to see why sanitized terms like evictions or property disputes rankle those who live there.
This is an eviction, and this is a property rights dispute. It's plain and simple. Look it up. These 4 buildings in Sheikh Jarrah, which is, by the way, a predominantly Palestinian neighborhood and will continue to be a predominantly Palestinian neighborhood even after these evictions. These 4 buildings in question were bought by 2 Jewish trusts in 1875 in Israel's self-defensive War of Independence. Jordan expelled the Jewish residents. Now, when Israel reclaimed that land in 1967 in yet another self-defensive war, it returned that property to the rightful owners. Since then, it's been in the ownership of Jews. In 1982, tenants from those residents acknowledged Jewish ownership. Their descendants, actually, are some of the appellants right now in this case. Basically, they just don't want to pay rent, and they're getting kicked out for it. It's very simple. Don't believe this lie.
And look, it is true that militants from Palestinian groups like Hamas fired over 1,000 rockets towards Israel this week, and that is reprehensible. But...
oh, you gotta love the but.
But the majority of those rockets thankfully didn't reach their target for a very clear reason.
Yeah, but one of them killed a 5-year-old who dressed up as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle in last Purim.
There is a massive imbalance when it comes to the two sides' weaponry and capabilities. While most of the rockets aimed toward Israeli citizens this week were intercepted, Israel's airstrikes were not.
I don't understand the argument here. While Hamas's rockets were intercepted, Israel did a better job and actually hit their targets. The actual question, John Oliver, if you're trying to make a moral argument, is what were the targets? Israel targets military targets. It finds out where Hamas is storing weapons, is storing armaments, houses its headquarters, and where the heads of Hamas and their militants, their terrorists, are actually residing. And it targets those spots. Hamas doesn't do the same. They wish to hit women, children, babies, anybody. That's what they want to accomplish.
They hit their targets, including a house in a refugee camp, a building housing the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and this 13-story office and apartment building. And while Israel insisted that there were military targets in that building...
What do you mean they insisted that there were military targets? Do you have evidence that these were not military targets? Because if you don't, then you're just making baseless accusations. These were military targets, and you can look at Israel's past operations in Gaza and see that Israel does an amazing job, an incredible job, an almost unbelievable job of targeting military targets solely, only military targets. The only reason that civilians are killed in Gaza is because Hamas wants that to happen. They use civilians as human shields. They have called for civilians to remain in their homes even though they know that Israel is about to strike those homes, even though they store weapons in those homes and they house headquarters in those homes. They urge the civilians to stay in those houses so that there will be civilian casualties and so that Israel will look bad.
And they destroyed it as humanely as possible, even warning people to evacuate beforehand. For the record, destroying a civilian residence sure seems like a war crime, regardless of whether you send a courtesy heads-up text.
John Oliver, I think, lives in La La Land. He doesn't understand how war is fought. I don't think he's ever been near a war. I don't think he's ever been in a hostile nation. I don't think he's ever wandered out of his comfortable bubble in which he lives on some high rise in I don't know where, Manhattan or LA. Okay, he doesn't understand war. The idea that the IDF warns civilians to leave their homes, this is hyper-moral activity on the part of a military power. No other military in the world behaves in this way. In this operation, there are instances where it's taken the IDF 2 hours to take down a building. Let's talk about how the IDF takes down a military target, which he, by the way, is totally washing over, calling them just civilian targets. Let's talk about it. The military, first of all, calls all the residents and tells them to leave, and tells them they have about an hour. Now, the hour is just a warning. We're trying to get them out there. Really, it takes 2 hours. Why? Because when that hour is up, the military drops, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, drops what's called a knock-knock bomb on the roof of the building, which causes little to no damage and serves as another warning for residents to leave. By the time everybody's out, and the IDF waits, okay? They take extreme measures to ensure that everybody is out of the building. They take out the building. Now, you might be asking yourself, how the hell does IDF ever kill anybody? We often don't. We have an extremely difficult time in killing the terrorists. And this is why operation after operation after operation, the heads of Hamas still survive to today. Because the IDF takes every precaution it can to only target military targets and to avoid civilian deaths. And again, the only reason there are civilian deaths in Gaza is because of the Hamas.
Somebody on Twitter said that the Palestinians don't have an Iron Dome. I say yes, they have an Iron Dome. It's called Don't Fire Rockets at Israeli Civilians, and we won't fire anything at Gaza.
Yeah, but there are a couple of differences. Iron Dome, for one, sounds much cooler. And also, it has the significant advantage of being an actual defense system that exists, unlike Gaza's, which is mostly try not to be where the bombs are landing.
Yeah, but that's completely ignoring the guy's point, which is absolutely valid. Don't fire rockets, you don't need an Iron Dome. If you don't have an Iron Dome, don't start a war.
And it's important to note here, the vast majority of the Palestinians in Gaza are not part of Hamas. They don't get together and all decide to launch rockets.
Actually, they all got together and decided to elect Hamas as their leadership in 2006. And the idea, and this is another common misconception that we have to debunk. The idea that most Palestinians in Gaza just want to live in peace is flatly false. It's just untrue. If you look at surveys done in Gaza, both by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and other independent sources, most Gazans support terrorism against Israel. Most Gazans are anti-Semites. It's just a fact. Okay? That doesn't mean they all deserve to die, but it does mean that these people support largely the actions of their government when their government launches terrorist acts of war against Israel. When their government fires indiscriminately on Israel, most Gazans support this activity. Again, the idea that they just want to live in peace, the Palestinians, is completely false. Okay, they are largely anti-Semitic. They educate their children to hate Jews. This is not some kind of libel. They idolize terrorists and shaheeds who blow themselves up and who kill babies, like Samir Kuntal, who killed a baby, who smashed a baby's head in with a rock. They idolize these people. They name streets after them. They name squares after them. Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank do not want peace. It's a fact.
Because they've been living under a suffocating blockade for 14 years.
They have a border with Egypt. That's literally impossible for us to implement.
Occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are essentially being governed by a form of apartheid, an assessment echoed by both international and Israeli human rights groups.
How are they governed by apartheid? They are, first of all, but it's Hamas's apartheid, which gives not different levels of freedom to different citizens, but zero freedom to any of its citizens. Palestinians in Gaza are not citizens of Israel. Let's just make that clear. So the idea that they're living under an Israeli apartheid is just absolutely absurd.
Life in Gaza is hard even when they are not being bombed, and the US government has implicitly co-signed on the brutally hard line Israel's been taking.
So first of all, life in Gaza is hard even when they're not getting bombed. True. That's their fault. That's because they spend all their money on terror. Two, the U.S. government greenlighting Israel's actions. Yeah, but they also just renewed $290 million in aid to Gaza, which is, again, going to be used for terror tunnels, rockets, and war.
And look, it's not that Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself. It's just that line cannot be used to excuse absolutely everything. Multiple children have been killed this week, 8 in a single strike just yesterday, and the US is heavily implicated here.
Actually, John Oliver, you are implicated here because you are spreading lies which continue to allow Hamas to actually cause the deaths of these innocent civilians.
Not just by serving as Israel's diplomatic shield at the UN, but by constantly refusing to criticize the indefensible.
The indefensible, what John Oliver means is Jews. Jews, to John Oliver, are indefensible.
Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Holy shit, he just asked you, is child murder bad? This really isn't hard. Just say yes.
Are the deaths of Palestinian children on Israel's hands? Is that Israel's responsibility? Absolutely not. Israel does everything in its power to avoid the death of Palestinian children and innocent civilians. Okay, so yes, killing innocent civilians with zero cause, absolutely wrong. Having casualties of war when you're targeting military targets that hold up humans as shields, that's a little bit more complex.
The only scenario in which the answer to is killing children wrong gets tricky is if you're a time traveller in 1890s Austria trying to explain why you just killed the Hitler family's bouncing new baby boy. I know how this looks, but trust me, it is complicated.
Or another scenario when a terrorist organization is firing rockets at your country's innocent civilians from behind hospitals, schools, civilians. That's also maybe a situation in which it might be a little bit complicated.
Both sides are firing rockets, but one side has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. Both sides are suffering heartbreaking casualties, but one side is suffering them exponentially. And it's not like the US is operating from the moral high ground here. It's obviously no stranger to drone-striking weddings and saying, we were just trying to target enemy combatants.
So the crux of John Oliver's argument, if you listen to his ending monologue, is both sides, but one side is more powerful, and both sides, but one side is suffering more losses. Neither of those are a morally qualitative argument. One side being more powerful and one side suffering more casualties doesn't bear any influence on the question of which side is more moral. Now the question, which side is more moral, John Oliver is right. There are not two sides to this equation. Israel is on the right side of history. Israel has the moral high ground. Gaza and Hamas want to kill innocent Israeli civilians, babies, women, children, men, anything they can get their hands on. And that's not just Hamas, but the majority of the Palestinian population within Gaza support them and are deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. There's one side to this equation, and Israel has the moral high ground.
But at the end of the day, I would hope that a real friend would tell me when I'm being an asshole, and definitely when I'm committing a fucking war crime.
John Oliver, as friends, you're being an asshole and an anti-Semite. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Check out the Two Nice Jewish Boys podcast for more of our content. See you around.